Um, Hello everyone, my name is Antonin Cheymol, and today I'm going to present the paper Avatar-Centered Feedback, Dynamic Avatar Alteration Can Induce Avoidance Behaviors to Virtual Dangers. So first, let me introduce you to a short video illustrating the problem that we want to address here. Here, the user is performing a metallurgy task in VR. Where they have to heat up a virtual ingot. And as the task is taking too long, they decide to bring their hand deeper inside the oven. And this is actually the problem that we want to address here. The fact that in general, in virtual reality, users often end up engaging in unrealistic and dangerous behaviors. Of course, here the user is not at risk of physical injuries. However, such behavior might still reduce different aspects of the user experience. First, for example, it might reduce the efficiency of various VR applications, for example, in training applications, by habituating the users to wrong movements, or more generally by leading them to experiences that are not planned by the VR designer, which is this one. And in addition, it might also impact the subjective quality of the VR experience by lowering the sensation that the VR experience is actually occurring, is actually real. So let's dig into the existing literature on this subject. So first, most of you probably already know and even experience that in VR, VR can elicit realistic reactions to various virtual dangers, whether it is in terms of behavioral responses, for example, by when a user is walking around a virtual pit instead of crossing it, or in terms of physiological responses, for example, when a fire breaks in a virtual environment when it triggers heart rate or skin conductance increases. However, we have to note that these effects are not systematic. Usually they depend on the danger, on the user, on the context, and are also often incomplete, as users usually do not respond fully realistically to these virtual dangers. And this is the reason why we can wonder about how we can find different ways that we could further increase these realistic responses toward the virtual dangers. And that brings us back to the limitation which I introduced earlier, with the users bringing their virtual hand directly inside the burning oven. So let's analyze this problem from the perspective of theoretical models of perception in VR. We can consider here two perceptual phenomena that can elicit realistic reaction in VR. First, the sense of embodiment, which leads the user to perceive and behave with the virtual avatar as their own body. And then the plausibility, which describes the user's feeling that virtual elements or events are really occurring. For example, in this case, a virtual fire. So taken together, this sensation leads the users to feel that the virtual risks to their virtual body is actually real. And in this case, for example, it would lead them to avoid bringing their hand directly inside the virtual fire. However, here the problem is that this sensation, we have to notice that the sensation is only elicited a priori, before any interaction with the virtual fire. And it's important to note that, however, when if the user actually experiences an interaction with this virtual danger, usually it doesn't lead to any consequences. And most likely, this absence of consequences will reduce the following sensation of fear to the incoming virtual dangers. And this is why in this study, we wonder how we could elicit a fear of virtual danger a posteriori, after experiencing the interaction with the virtual danger. So in other words, a feedback to the virtual danger. And here I should mention that we are not necessarily interested in hardware solutions such as haptic feedback, because of course we don't want to injure any of our participants, but also because usually haptic feedback are cumbersome, really specific to a given feedback, and environmentally costly. So rather we focus here on software solutions. And that's led us to present the avatar-centered feedback, a concept that we formally define as a dynamic alteration of the avatar's virtual appearance or movement in response to its interaction in the virtual environment. So for example, here is an example where you can see the avatar, which is in the cold, relatively far from a virtual fire. And you can see the avatar-centered feedback is taking place with the hand starting to shiver and sorry, I will come back just to show again the hand starting to shiver and and frostbite starting to display on the virtual hand to show the danger and the feedback to the temperature. And as the hand is comes back close to a source of temperature, the alteration starts to reduce to communicate the increase of temperature. This approach, of course, can be applied to numerous other contexts by communicating, for example, a cut, a burn, or even non-dangerous body reaction, for example, excitement. In the paper, we provide a complete framework detailing different types of feedback that can be applied, and I invite you to check them out if you are interested. So, but then we also need to conduct a user experiment to assess the efficiency of this approach. The experiment consists in measuring the impact of outstanding feedback triggered by a fire on behavioral and subjective experience. All of this in a metallurgy scenario. The experiment followed a between subjects design with 42 participants split between a feedback and a control group, which defined whether they would receive the avatar-centered feedback or not. So let me describe a bit more, show you the illustration of this experiment. First participant had to complete a heating operation. That was the sort of the main task, which consisted in heating an ingot in a virtual oven. And participants in the feedback group, as you can see, would present different type of avatar-centered feedback. Their appearance would change in relation to depending on the distance to the fire, with their hand reddening and presenting burn marks as it approaches the fire. Also, it's more subtle, but they will also simulate. They will also present movement alteration with sort of withdrawal reflex movement when a spark would burst inside the virtual oven, which should happen just in a second, just here like this. So that was the heating operation. And just after, they were asked to complete a press operation, which consisted in flattening the virtual ingot with a press by pressing a virtual button that you can see just here. And I will describe in a minute, but basically this task served as distraction to the user to present them later to other unexpected type of danger, which I will present in a minute. You can see here that maybe it's not really visible, but the burns mark remaining on the virtual hand. So the experiment consisted in 6 repetitions of these 2 consecutive tasks, so the heating and the press operation. Then there was 2 size of tongues, first long and then shorter, to assess different incentives to get closer to the fire. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the experiment, participants were presented to 2 additional dangers, which were not mentioned to them before. Here, which were the virtual button that was starting to burst sort of like electric arcs, and a circular saw that was approaching the virtual hand of the user. And here, participants did not receive any feedback about these dangers, and the goal was to measure any potential carried over effect of experiencing before the fire avatar-centered feedback on the general perception of danger in the environment. Specifically, we measured how long they would wait and stay away from the electric arc before finally reaching the button and pressing the button, and how far how far they would move away from the virtual saw when approaching the virtual hand. So for the measurement, basically we use the user's movement as for the as a behavioral measurement, and a subjective questionnaire about embodiment and plausibility. So we had 2 major hypotheses in this experiment. First, we expected that participants presented to the avatar-centered feedback would demonstrate more realistic responses toward the associated dangers. So danger they would receive feedback from, in this case, the fire during the heating operation, the oven in the heating operation. And then we expected participants of the feedback group to also demonstrate more realistic responses toward other dangers that they did not receive any feedback from, which is the electric arcs and the circular saw. Because as I mentioned earlier, we had the hypothesis that avatar-centered feedback could have a sort of carried over effect over the general perception of danger in the virtual scene. So let's observe the result of the experiment, starting with the behavioral responses toward the virtual fire. Here you can observe the average duration time of the heating operation split between the control and the feedback group, and between the long and the short tongue size. And the most interesting that is that we found that in both strong conditions, participants in the feedback group spent significantly more time completing the heating operation, meaning that they took more precaution and distance from the oven when performing the heating task. And this is corroborated by this heat map that showcases the average hand position during the task. Again, results split between feedback and control group, long and short tongue size. And on the graph, you can see the outside of the oven on the left and the inside on the right. And the red dots shows the most frequent hand position during the heating operation. And what we can see here, what you can clearly observe is that the feedback group on the top side kept their hands significantly further away from the oven, from the center of the oven. So taken together, these results show that using this concept of average standard feedback can increase realistic behaviors toward the associated danger, the danger that user will receive feedback from. So in this case, the fire. And so now if I switch to the results regarding participant behaviors toward other dangers, so dangers that they did not receive feedback from, the electricity and the circular saw, we did not find any significant differences in terms of like reaction to electricity, but for the distance to that the user will take from the virtual. So we found that in the feedback group, users kept their hand significantly further away from the circular saw when it was approaching their hand. And interestingly, that seems to indicate that average standard feedback can, to a specific danger could be carried over to the general perception of danger in virtual environment. So if you have a feedback to a fire, you may have the sensation that generally you're more vulnerable in the virtual environment, and so be more precautious even to other danger that you will encounter in the virtual scene. I will not elaborate too much on the subjective result here. We did not find any significant difference in terms of embodiment or plausibility. I don't have time too much to elaborate on this now, but I invite you to check out the paper as we discuss the potential causes and the conclusion that can be drawn from these results. There is some limitation, of course, of this work. I think we probably should try to generalize this result to other type of dangers. For example, sort of instant damage type of dangers, or even try to find generic sort of feedback that could be applied to a wider range of dangers. Also to even other interactions that are not injurious, such as fatigue, excitement, social touch. And it would be also interesting to see how much this effect could, how much the time of different VR sessions can affect these results. So finally, to conclude, in the paper, we presented the concept of average-centered feedback, a device-free approach consisting in a dynamic alteration of the avatar's appearance and movement in response to the interaction with the virtual environment. In a user study, we demonstrated that avatar-centered feedback could induce users' realistic behaviors toward the associated dangers. And further, we also found that this approach could even present carried-over effect by even impacting behaviors toward other dangers, altering the general perception of dangers in a VR scenario. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stay available to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
I have a question. To be fair, I was part of the control group, so I do know the experiment. But it's more about future works. What kind of generic feedback do you think would work well? Like, you think just notifying users that, hey, you're in danger could be enough? Or do they really need to see the consequences, like the bad ones?
Thank you for your question. I think for this, what I envision is like we could get inspired from, for example, video games or cartoons. For example, in a cartoon, it's not necessarily realistic, but you see when you get hurt, when a character gets hurt, it starts maybe to like get red or something like this. And even if it's not realistic, we understand what it means, and maybe it might be interesting to see how this like more abstract feedback could be applied to have a more generic feedback, both because it could be applied to a wider range of danger, but also because it could also communicate an injury to dangers that does not in the reality have impact on the appearance of the users. If you get sick or poison, you don't have a visual impact on your body, but we could communicate it in a more abstract way. I hope we could try it later. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting presentation. Just a short question. What's your opinion on the intensity of the feedback? Will the intensity of the feedback impact how strong people avoid other types of dangers? Because, I mean, you could always exaggerate the feedback, right? Do you have any opinion on that?
So that's actually, thank you for your question. We discussed this a bit in the paper, because actually, of course it can have a stronger feedback can have the effect of pushing the user away from the danger, but it can have also a drawback, because if it's too intense and too exaggerated, user might start to, at some point, they still have to finish the task, right? And if you exaggerate too much and that prevents them to carry the task, they might just at some point start to ignoring the feedback. So I guess you have to balance well the feedback to make sure that they won't get to this point. They feel I cannot respect anyways the feedback, so I will have to injure my avatar. And of course that also depends of what you exactly want the users to do, how much you want to push them away from a training task, what you exactly want them to expect them to do.
Yeah, I think in an industry training scenario that would be very interesting.
Yeah, that's one of
the
applications we envision. Thank you.
Thanks for that great talk. Okay, we're going to move on to the last talk in the session.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.